Before I begin, I'd like to note that education is a topic that is vast and daunting. The complexities and economics and politics of it, experts have been studying it for longer than I've been alive. But that being said, I've been two things my entire life, a student and a baseball fan. And so I'd like to draw from my experiences in each and see how we evaluate students and how might that, how we evaluate baseball players and how might that be applied to evaluating students. So to begin, I'd like to talk about why the location of the press box matters. Now, when you're looking at how we evaluate baseball players, there's really two ways in which we do it. One is how they perform at the plate, hitting the ball, and the second is how they perform in the field, fielding the ball. And if you look at how we assess their batting abilities, it's a very standard, straightforward process. Once the pitcher releases the ball, there's a limited set of outcomes that can happen after that ball crosses the plate. And more importantly, we've been collecting the same amount of data and the same type of data for many, many years related to assessing a batter's hitting ability. Now, fielding, on the other hand, is a much thornier issue, and it gets more complex, and that's because it involves a lot of qualitative analysis. In order to kind of collect stats about fielding, Major League Baseball employs people called stat stringers, who are tasked with the responsibility of plotting where a ball landed on the field and how it got there. And we use this information to try and assess fielders and their fielding ability. Now, in stadiums where the press box is set very high, more statistics and more balls that should be called lineouts are called, should be called as flyouts are called as lineouts, simply because of the perspective of this stat stringer. So what this really represents is the introduction of the human element and the human margin for error in assessing fielding. So where might there be parallels in how we assess students? Well, there's really two ways in which we assess students. One is standardized testing, and the second is grades and GPA. Now, standardized testing shares a lot of the same traits that we use to assess batting in baseball. It's a standard and repeatable process. Each student sees the same test. And we've been collecting the same information about these tests for many, many years. And most importantly, there's a limited set of outcomes that can happen once that test comes in front of a student. Fill in the bubble, fill in the blank. Now, on the other hand, GPA involves much more qualitative analysis. And no one student, classroom, or teacher is the same. Similar as to one play is not the same in Major League Baseball. And so this introduces the subject to where is the press box located in the stadium. It brings in that qualitative factor in analyzing these students' abilities. So how has Major League Baseball attempted to kind of overcome this shortcoming in how they assess a fielder's ability? Well, in recent years, they've become committed to more granular data collection. Now, they've done this across the board for both batting and fielding, but for our purposes, let's look at a fielding example. This is a graphic showing a recent technology employed by Major League Baseball called FieldFX, and it essentially tracks a fielder's location, where they ended up, where the ball landed, and how efficient their route was getting there. Now, obviously, we're not going to be putting in cameras to track where a student is sitting in a classroom. However, the principle behind this is that smaller pieces of data to draw greater conclusions about a given player or a given student. So in looking to apply this to education, we could look at maybe the time of day that a class was taken, the size of the class, or the subject. Right now, a student goes through a semester, and at the end of the semester, they get a grade, and all their classes put together, they get a GPA that defines their ability on a day-to-day basis. And there's nothing wrong with GPA, but if we can look at it on a smaller level and get more information about that GPA, it gives it greater context, and we can draw greater conclusions about that student. Which leads to the second piece of this, which is why context is so important. Now, in baseball, the statistic batting average has been around for a very, very long time. And it's a good statistic. It tells a story, and it's fairly simple. Hits divided by at-bats. Now, in recent years, Major League Baseball, with their commitment to granular data collection, has seen the advent of the statistic BABIP, batting average on balls in play. And what baseball statisticians like to refer to this as the luck factor. How lucky did a player get? When he put the ball into play, how often did it go for a hit? So looking at this in application for Major League Baseball, let's take the example of Brandon Moss, a first baseman for the Oakland Athletics. Now, 2012 was Brandon Moss's rookie year, and prior to the advent of BABIP, we see that he hit .291. Now, in today's MLB, that's pretty darn good. And prior to the advent of BABIP, we might have said that he was due to improve. It was his first look at Major League pitching, and he hit very, very well. However, with the context of BABIP, we see that he hit 359, which was about 68 points higher than his batting average, along with 60 points higher than the league average batting average on balls in play. So, on their own, there's nothing inherently wrong with batting average or BABIP. They each tell a story, and from that story we can derive conclusions. However, given the context of the other, they become exponentially more powerful. So now we see that Brandon Moss might be due for a bit of a regression the following year, which is exactly what happened, as his batting average dropped 35 points and his BABIP regressed to about the league average of 300. So applying this to education, we are going to look at that standardized testing piece of it. Now, unfortunately, graduation tests and SAT data isn't immediately available to a student like myself. However, every year, the U.S. Department of Education publishes its annual Condition of Education report. And this looks at education statistics on a macro level. So let's look at a chart that's included in that report. This shows percentage of teachers as staff in a given state's public school system. Now, just like batting average, there's nothing inherently wrong with this. It tells a story and we can derive conclusions from that story. However, it lacks context. It lacks some smaller pieces of data that can tell a better story about it. So for the sake of example, some smaller pieces of data that we could pull about that map, that shows percentage of teachers as staff. Why can't we look at percentage of teachers in an English department? And then see if there may or may not be a correlation with literacy rate. So the final piece of this is Moneyball. And Moneyball has been brought into the limelight in recent years due to the book and movie that came out starring this guy up here. And what Moneyball chronicles is the early 2000s Oakland Athletics and how they overcame market size and resource discrepancies in order to compete on a level playing field in Major League Baseball. Now, to take an example that's very near and dear to my heart and exhibit these market size and resource discrepancies, let's look at the Cleveland Indians and the New York Yankees. Now, the Cleveland Indians are my favorite baseball team, and over the past 12 years, they've had an average payroll of about $65 million. And in that time, they've netted 2 playoff appearances and no World Series championships. Similarly, in the same time period, the New York Yankees have an average payroll of $200 million, and in that time have 9 playoff appearances and 2 World Series titles. Now, as a younger fan, I never understood why this discrepancy existed, and it frustrated me, angered me. However, I've come to realize the economics of baseball and economics as a whole make that first number a reality that's never going to change. A team like the New York Yankees, with the market size and resources that they have, will always outspend the Cleveland Indians. Now, this is a loose example, but we see similar traits in our education sphere. A school district like Albuquerque, New Mexico, with a median household income of less than $40,000, has a high school graduation rate of around 47%. Whereas Montgomery County, Maryland, with a median household income of around $92,000, has a high school graduation rate around 86%. So these parallels are not perfect, but the challenges that we're trying to overcome are very similar, and strikingly similar, in fact. And so if we apply the principles to how baseball is trying to overcome these challenges, we can learn a lot and apply that to the classroom. And those principles are, 1, collecting more granular data, collecting smaller pieces of data to tell a better story about a student and the classroom. The second is giving greater context to the data that already exists. There's a lot of data that we've been collecting about education, but why can't we strengthen that data and the integrity of that data by giving it greater context, the same way that BABIP gives context to batting average that we didn't have before. And finally, letting data drive the decision making. Moneyball wouldn't be Moneyball without that market size and resource discrepancy. But by improving their assessment of talent at the plate, the Oakland Athletics also improved their assessment of talent on the mound, the pitchers. And for the sake of our example, the pitchers would be the teachers. And so they then applied the lessons that they learned and the greater conclusions that they were able to derive in making pragmatic decisions that fit their market size. And so if we let the data drive the decision making and let that data also influence pragmatic decision making in allocation of our resources, then we can bring Moneyball into the classroom and future generations of students will benefit.